which means that I got to spend the day in a low to moderate grade anxiety state, but here we are, finally. It also means that you guys might be a little restless. So as you're able and willing, I'd like you to stand up. We're just gonna stretch. Don't worry, I'm not gonna make you do anything weird. I just wanna get the blood moving a little bit. And so my research is on adolescents. So if you were ever a teenager, please stretch your left arm. Should be everybody but that baby. Yeah. As far as I know, yeah, I don't think we have any kids here. Okay. All right. And your right arm, if you ever felt lonely as a teenager. Up or over, whatever you'd like. You don't have to raise it. It's okay. Okay. All right. And then you can be back to normal. Have a seat, except me. I will stay standing. Now I get to try and wrangle the remote. Yes. Okay. All right. So as you've learned, my name is Christy Berg McDonald. I changed the slide already. I was so anxious to see if the remote worked. But I'm a PhD student at Western University. I'm a lonely researcher, but I am not alone. And I'm just going to go back. So I just want to do a quick word of thanks for people that I get to work with. Scott Leatherdale and Karen Pate out of the University of Waterloo. Especially the data that I'm going to talk about today. They're heading up that study. And then Julie Aikenschirmer is my supervisor at Western. Okay, now we're getting to teens. So we've all been there, and we probably all know at least one teen, but just to frame the understanding of adolescents, adolescents are going through a period of really rapid changes in their physical, psychological, and social functioning. Now, obviously, they're growing physically, going through changes in height, changes that come with puberty, but their brains are also changing. So when we're children, our brains are growing, there's lots of connections developing, and as we get to adolescence, our brains start to just become more efficient. So there's what we call synaptic pruning, where certain connections are cut off, the ones that we don't use. And then there's more efficiency built into the connections that we have made. And so psychologically, teens are developing improved judgment, better impulse control, long-term planning, and the major psychological skill of thinking and abstract reasoning. And so developmental theorist Erik Erikson noted this area of development as being where we are trying to develop our identity. So we're now able to understand that abstract concept that I am my own person, and then also to start thinking about what does that mean, and what does that mean in the context of all the people around me. And so part of that development of identity is this struggle between a need for independence from our families and our siblings, but also, as some have pointed out, they're still human, that fundamental need to belong somewhere. So if we're stepping away from, I'm independent from my parents or my caregivers, but I still need to belong somewhere, peer relationships increase in importance. But they also increase in complexity and instability. So whereas as children, often peer relationships are, who do I like to play with? Who do I run around with? It becomes more about sharing ourselves, sharing our emotions, and a little bit more intimacy. But peer relationships can also be very unstable, especially in the adolescent years. If teens are exploring different aspects of their identity, they may be shifting different groups, different types of activities, and so friendships that are connected with, perhaps with the family, perhaps with a hobby they used to have, they might not have those anymore. And so it creates this, while this is all part of normal development, it also creates a vulnerability. And low peer and family support is associated with increased loneliness. We've talked lots about loneliness, so I will go through this fairly quickly, but it's typically defined as an unpleasant experience, and it's about the discrepancy between our actual social relationships and our expected social relationships, either in quantity or quality. And just as with adolescence, loneliness also involves our physical, psychological, and social functioning. Research has shown that in adolescence, loneliness is associated with fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and then medical conditions such as asthma, migraines, arthritis, hypertension, back pain. From the psychological perspective, loneliness in adolescence is associated with anxiety and depression, low overall mental health, and low self-esteem, and increased risk of addiction. As far to talk about the social functioning, there are a lot of different models of loneliness and how it relates to social functioning, but I want to draw your attention to this one called the Integrated Theory of Loneliness by Jan Geerfeld, Van Tilburg, and Dijkstra from 2018. And what I think is important about this theory of loneliness and this model is that it includes the individual level. And from my perspective, I'm in the Department of Psychology, and we're often looking at individual differences. And what is it about personality, about our development, that's impacting loneliness? But this theory also, it enters the societal level as well. And that's really important for understanding the data that I'm going to present to you today. So, what do you call, little humor here, what do you call adolescents during lockdown? Anybody? Quarantines? All right. Okay, light humor aside, the beginning of lockdown in March 2020 obviously drastically changed life for the average teenager. So during times of strict lockdown, it meant few to no social events. It meant no social gatherings outside of immediate family. And then for upwards of 2 years, it meant there was instability and limited opportunity for regular participation in sports, social clubs, lessons, even part-time jobs. In the school experience, we know there was periods of remote learning, but even when they were in school, there were limited opportunities for group work, for socializing. And so broadly, what this means is that there was decreased time with friends and increased time with family. So few teens would have been living completely isolated, but there's two things to note here. So one is that this disrupts the developmental goal of adolescents to become more independent and to explore ways that they can develop their identity. And on the other hand, if you think of the integrated model of loneliness, the societal expectation of that has decreased. So everyone is, especially at the beginning, everyone is at home, so we don't expect teens to be going out and exploring these things. So there's two different ways that you could be thinking about this, is that they can't meet those developmental goals, or it's harder, but also the pressure of how to create that identity as a teenager has lessened. So this period of history, I say history, but we're still in it. It really presents an opportunity for us to explore the roots of loneliness in adolescence and the impact of the change at the societal level. So as I mentioned, I'm using some data that's collected at the University of Waterloo from the COMPASS study. And the COMPASS study, cannabis use, obesity, mental health, physical activity, alcohol use, smoking, and sedentary behavior. Too much of a mouthful, so we call it the COMPASS study. And it's an ongoing study since 2012 and has funding to 2027. And it's, as you can imagine, collecting health behavior data from high school students in Canada, in BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. And each year, the survey changes a little bit. So while it started in 2012, they started looking at loneliness in 2017. So in 2017, the study introduced this measure of loneliness. How often did you feel lonely in the past week? None or less than 1 day, 1 to 2 days, 3 to 4 days, and 5 to 7 days. So the data that I'm looking at, so we have data for 2 full high school cohorts. So from 2017, as I said, when the loneliness measure started, so that cohort started grade 12, and then, they started grade 9, and then to grade 12 have finished the whole study. And then we have a second cohort who started in 2018, and then to 2022, which was the latest round of data that I had. Oh, and in case you forgot when COVID was, it was at the end of the 2019-2020 school year, and then obviously continued to impact the years following. So the objectives for my study, I wanted to examine and compare the trajectories of loneliness in each cohort. And so we've talked about when loneliness is most prominent. Obviously, loneliness in seniors is a really key issue. Loneliness actually increases throughout adolescence, peaks in young adulthood, decreases throughout middle adulthood, and then peaks again in older adulthood. So there's been studies about trajectories of loneliness in adolescents, but we've got a really, as I said, a unique piece of history here. And I wanted to see, because these teens would have experienced COVID lockdowns at different points in their high school career, and how did that impact loneliness for them? So our hypothesis, we expected that for each of them, ratings of loneliness would be highest around initial lockdowns. And then the second objective of the study was to evaluate changes in the trajectory over early COVID and mid-COVID years. And so for that, we then expect a decrease in loneliness after the 2019-2020 year. So if you're into stats, here's some descriptive statistics. Just gives a sample size. And then the means, you can already, this is means of loneliness. You can already see it starts each year, gets a little bit higher. So that's, I'm not going to say it's promising, but that's what we would have expected to see given other research. So the method that we use to study this is something called latent basis growth model. And it's just a type of latent modeling that's useful in estimating the shape of a trajectory that might not be linear. So in a regular high school year, we might expect grade 9 to 12 a linear increase, but because of COVID, we don't know. And so this is a different way of statistically looking at it when we expect there might be some changes in the later years. So for this, we've constrained the first two time points to be 0 and 1, and then we freely estimated time points 3 and 4. And again, some stats. This is model fit information, and this basically is just telling us that the model we proposed is a good fit for the data that we have. So looking at results, so here we can see cohort 1, so that's students who started in 2017, that's the solid line. Cohort 2 is the dotted line. And we can see that they have different trajectory shapes. So for cohort 1, we see very linear, and about a 0.2 increase each year, which is statistically significant. The effect size is pretty small, but if you take from grade 9 to 12, comparing those two, that is a moderate increase in loneliness over high school. For cohort 2, it looks a little different. Although each year the change between each year is statistically significant, again, the first 3, so if you think of this as grade 9, 10, 11, each of that is a small effect size, but we see a change in shape at the end where it's in a negative direction, which is different from cohort 1, which was positive the whole way through. So how we interpret these results, indeed the experience of loneliness was different for cohorts 1 and 2. We see that our hypothesis was partially supported, that loneliness was highest in the lockdowns, but importantly, it wasn't right away. And we also looked at, I didn't put tons of data up here because I wanted it to be fairly concise, but students who had filled out the questionnaire shortly after lockdown started were not significantly lonelier than the rest of the population. But we do see that it's highest during that year 2020, 2021 was probably the most, or had the greatest amount of remote learning and the greatest amount of disruptions. Hypothesis 2 was not supported, but that's just because we didn't see it peak in 2019 to 2020. We saw it keep increasing. But we do see a promising little decrease at the end of the year, at the end of the data for cohort 2. And I don't want to extrapolate too much, so I'm hoping that we're going to get another wave of data, and so we are hopeful that this trend really continues. Okay, so at minimum, we can say that loneliness stopped increasing for that cohort after 2020, 2021. But it did increase consistently, loneliness increased consistently throughout adolescence. But it's not a reactionary emotion. We saw it build up through the year of disruption. We didn't see it spike immediately after lockdown started. It really seemed to be something that was not reactionary, but built over time. And then lastly, I take a little bit of hope for resilience. There's research about tragic events that shows that there's different trajectories that people experience, but that including continued stress, decreasing stress, but the most common one is that people are resilient. And while we do need to, we've talked a lot about different programming for combating loneliness. I'm very excited about that. We can also take hope that resilience is the norm, and hopefully with these programs as well, we can increase the amount of people that experience that resilience. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? We've got time for a couple of brief questions. There's one right at the back there. Just holler.
No. So this is really tied to, they fill out the survey at their high school. So it only goes up until grade 12. That's a good question. There's kind of mixed research on whether this generation is lonelier than the last one. I do think it is developmental. I'm not saying that this generation is not lonelier than previous ones. It might be true. But in some things I've read in contrast to loneliness in seniors, we can kind of see why, right? They're losing friends, they're losing mobility. But why would young adults be lonely? It doesn't seem to make sense. So I actually think that it's but it becomes very distressing for them because they see that they should be having these great social experiences, but they're not, or they feel they're not. And so it's a different, I think the loneliness is qualitatively a little bit different between those two groups. But I think there's something in the development of that stage, that vulnerability that seems to come up for every generation.
And then there's another question there. Just what's to be our last question, if you just yell it out. No.
So the respondents, oh, I see. Okay, so the respondents who filled it out were bored and lonely, so they're more likely to fill it out if they're lonely. No, that's a good question. The thing is actually that the ones who would have filled it out virtually would have been the ones right during, or who had kind of more, they would have filled it out at home, would have been filling it out right during the first lockdowns. And they didn't, when I compared those two groups, they weren't lonelier than the ones who had filled it out a few months prior. The students who filled it out in the year following would have done it at school online. So response rates were typically, especially in the schools, pretty good, because students are kind of, well, this is what we're doing today. We're doing a survey. Yes, they can say no, but most of them, it's no big deal. So I'm not sure if it would have been, boredom would have factored in all that much.